Thanks everyone for coming. As Rob said, I'm Oliver Hatfield. I'm a second-year PhD student at Lancaster University, and today I'm going to present some work I've done in collaboration with MathSport on detecting tennis match fixing in in-play markets. So match fixing in tennis has been in the news reasonably often over the last couple of years. Most recent I heard was there was some question marks over a couple of the Wimbledon qualifiers. The sort of main modern trend for match fixing being in the news arguably goes back to January 2016 last year. Some of you may remember the BBC and BuzzFeed jointly published they released a load of leaked documents that had information on various investigations into match fixing that had occurred since 2007. There were details of the investigations, several lists of suspected match fixers, although these were redacted in the public release. Now, why did this happen? Well, the Tennis Integrity Unit has been accused by various sources, so players, officials, law enforcement, of not doing enough to stamp out the problem of match fixing in tennis and of being too secretive to be accountable for its actions. So we're going to have a little look at match fixing in tennis ourselves. This, funny enough, happened about 3 months after we started the work, so it's quite convenient in some ways. So match fixing in tennis. The main one trend for it arguably begins in 2007. It was a high-profile match where both players were found innocent at the end, I should add. Don't want the lawyers on me. Between Davydenko, who was ranked 4th in the world, against Martin Vasaja-Ageo, who was ranked 87th at the time. It was a match at the Sopot Open in Poland. So you'd have thought Davydenko, being ranked far superior to his opponent, should be the heavy favourite in these matches. And indeed he was for much of the pre-match market. We've got decimal odds here. For those of you not familiar with those, if you take 1 over the odds, you more or less get a probability. So Davydenko was the pre-match favourite for much of it, until about an hour before the match, when the odds swung in completely the opposite direction. Suddenly, Martin Vasaja-Ageo is a heavy favourite to win this match. Which seems bizarre. There was no new injury news. It's just bore almost no resemblance to reality. Davydenko then goes on to win the first set, ranked 83 places higher than his opponent. He's 1 set up in a 3-set match. You'd have thought he should be the favourite, but no. Davydenko then goes on to lose the 2nd set and retires midway through the 3rd set with an injury. This set off all sorts of alarm bells in the betting markets. Almost all of the activity on this match was voided. It was about 10 times as much gambled on this match as was expected for a match of this prestige. So the match was investigated. It had its difficulties, the investigations. In the end, no evidence was found against either player. But they changed the protocols of these investigations to make it easier to conduct them in the future. And the Tennis Integrity Unit was set up to deal with these sorts of problems. Fast forward to today, and, well, say January last year, and they're accused of not fulfilling that goal quite as well as perhaps we would have liked them to. So what we're doing in this project is we're going to use betting data to try and identify suspicious patterns in betting markets. Now, much of the work in the literature focuses on swings in pre-match markets. That is helpful because it gives you an idea of when large unexpected money comes in on a certain player. It does miss out on a few crucial details, though. So sometimes these swings can come because new information is available. So maybe news about a player becomes apparent during the pre-match market. Or sometimes if a player's had a long-term injury and is coming back, say they had 6 months out, it's quite difficult for bookmakers to know exactly how to price up these players. And then if the public disagrees with what the bookmaker says at the start, you can get these big swings and misidentify suspicious behaviour. Also, a lot of the gambling that occurs as a result of match fixing happens in play. So if you focus on the pre-match markets, that's not good either. So we're going to focus on in-play odds to identify strange behaviour. So as an outline of what's to come, we're going to start off by looking at what odds behaviour we'd expect in normal matches, fixed matches. In order to build these models to describe these, we're going to need to do in-play tennis modelling. And in order to do that, we're going to need an idea of how good the two players are. There might be some uncertainty because of injuries. We're going to look at how this affects our predictions of the matches and then compare these models with odds. Before I go any further, just leave you with a quote from Nigel Willerton, head of Tennis Integrity Unit. It says, "Betting data alone is not sufficient to bring forwards a prosecution." So you can do all the work you like with betting data, you find some really odd patterns, but it's not necessarily going to lay the blame at the feet of the player. You don't know if it's the coaches releasing news or, well, it could be anything. So all we can do is identify matches that look strange and highlight them for further investigation. So, introduction to gambling, for those of you who've not been sucked in by the temptation. In a normal match, bookmaker will pick a set of odds that they think are reasonable. Say they think two players are even, they might call it a 50-50 match. Now, if the public, on average, thinks it's more one player has got a 60% chance of winning, they'll bet more on that player than the bookmakers expect. If that player then goes on to win and the bookmakers did nothing, they'd be liable to substantial losses. So what they do is they shift their odds to encourage betting on the other player, to balance the books if you like, minimise their expected losses. So this then, well, if you had a perfectly efficient market, this would incorporate all of the information available on it, and the bookmaker's odds should roughly correspond to a reasonable probability estimate for the two players winning a match against each other. Now, say you fixed a match. You've bribed a tennis player off to lose the match, and you see figures in the literature in the orders of tens of thousands of pounds in order to do this. In order to make your money back on this, you're going to have to bet quite substantial amounts to make your money back. As we've seen above, the bookmaker is going to have to shift their odds in response to this, and it's this that you're looking to pick up, these shifts that don't represent the publicly available information. So we want to detect these shifts. Now, of course, whenever you're looking for differences between a model and reality, we need a measure of uncertainty. So suppose you've got these two matches. The black is the in-play odds. The blue is your estimates of what you think the odds should be. Do we think these matches are suspicious? One on the left looks about fine, I'd say. We've got all the dots sitting nicely on those lines. One on the right, maybe, maybe not. Your guess is as good as mine. But no. So without any uncertainty on these, it's almost impossible to say anything. So we're going to look for uncertainty on these predictions as we go forward through our modelling. So onto the tennis modelling. How would we even go about getting dots like this to start with? So the standard assumption in tennis modelling is that in a match between player I and player J, probability player I wins a point on serve is PI. I should probably be PIJ there, because it's a function of I and J. Whether you win points on serve depends on how good the opponent is at returning. Is this assumption reasonable? The independence assumption might not quite be right. You know, you get people going on a bit of a run sometimes. Is it always going to be the same probability, regardless of dependence? There's some evidence in this study done between these two players that, by class in 2001, that suggests the best players are more consistent on the best points. So they found evidence that these assumptions aren't quite right, but also that they perform a reasonable first-order approximation to what happens, that you don't lose very much at all by making these assumptions. If you do that, you can get a Markov chain representing the match, where states represent scores, and your transition probabilities are these PIs. So say you've got a game, you start off at love all, you've got probability P of going up to 15 love, then you might come down here, bounce around the deuces a bit before eventually going into either the win or the lose state. You can use the standard properties of absorbing Markov chains to find the probability then of going from love to a win, to find the probability of winning a game. You can use the probability of winning games to find the probability of winning sets, and use that to find the probability of a player winning a match. So let's suppose you do this. You've got player 2's serve probability on the bottom, player 1 on the left, and the heat map represents the probability that player 1 wins the match. Now, the first thing you might notice about this graph is that most of it isn't very interesting. You've got these big patches here where the match is a foregone conclusion, and the big patch up here. The other thing to note is that most of the information is contained in the distance from the diagonal. So if you're here or here, the main thing that matters is how far you are from this diagonal. So this motivates a reparameterization of our model. So we're going to call mu the average of the two players' serve probability, and lambda forms a dominance parameter. If we do that, basically rotate the graph, and we see that mu doesn't matter very much at all. So just to reduce the number of parameters in our model, we are only going to focus on lambda and fix mu at a global average. So this is all very well and good if you've got these P1 and P2s. Of course we don't. We want to estimate them or find distributions over them to represent the uncertainty we have in our estimates. The way we've chosen to do this is look at the Glicko rating system. Now this has similarities to the ELO rating system. For those of you who've seen that, it works in chess. Each player has a rating. As you win matches, you gain points. As you lose matches, you lose points. In Glicko, by contrast, each player has a rating, but we assume that we don't know that rating, that you've instead got a mean and a variance around that rating. Whenever two players meet, use a logistic model based on the difference between the two players' ratings to build a model for the probability each player wins. And depending on the match outcome, you shift your posterior beliefs about the ratings to represent what you've just seen. And we also assume that these ratings evolve over time, so players get better and worse throughout their careers. So it's basically a Gaussian state space model where we approximate our posteriors by a Laplace approximation every time. A consequence of this is that if a player goes a long time without playing, the variance around their rating will increase due to uncertainty. So this lets us treat injured players different to the rest of the players. So I've got an example here comparing two titans of the sport. So Rafael Nadal kicked off his career in the early 2000s, possibly lost his first couple of matches, but then went on and won a lot of matches, and the rest is history. We can see here there's a bit where his rating's quite flat for a couple of months, and you can see the subtle effect of the uncertainty increasing around his rating. By contrast, we've got Greg Rosetsky, who reached the heady heights of rank 4 in the late 90s. Yeah, he was doing quite well for a while, and then he declined. Obviously, once he retires, his uncertainty explodes, but that's not as relevant for the modelling by that point. So the good point of it is it lets us evaluate how sure we are about our predictions, which is very helpful in our context, whether odds agree with the predictions. The uncertainty also allows us to treat injured players differently. Disadvantages, ELO ratings are zero-sum, so your global average stays constant over time. It's not quite true in the Glicko unless you take appropriate steps to address the degeneracy. There's also a little bit more of a computational overhead as well. So we've got our Glicko ratings, got distributions over the two ratings theta I and theta j, and you can use those to get distribution over this using our logistic model. And you could stop there if you wanted, just take these predictions and compare them to your pre-match odds. But we want to go further, we want to look at the in-play modelling. So we want to get a distribution over the match win probability of the model at every single game in the match. So how we do that? And a quick overview of where we are so far. So we've got the Glicko ratings. We go from there to a distribution over the match win probability. Now, match win probability, we've already seen as a function of lambda, the difference between the two players based on the Markov chain. So standard change of variables, you can go for distribution on the match win probability to distribution on this. Now, during the match, you've got all your estimates of distributions over how good the players are, but sometimes someone just comes out and plays badly, and you want your model to be able to reflect that. So as games are observed, we update our distributions on lambda all the way through to account for the fact, well, that players might not be playing as you've expected, because everyone in the public is going to be doing it. They say, oh, he's playing well, I'll bet money on him. So we get a posterior in lambda, and then at each game of the match, we go back from lambda to the match win probability distribution using the earlier absorbing Markov chain ideas. And if we put all that together, this is what we get for the two matches we considered at the start. So again, the black is the odds, the blue is the mean of our match win probability estimates, and we've got a 95% confidence interval. And we see in these cases the black is saying quite snugly in the middle of our confidence intervals. And you might look at that and say, gosh, those confidence intervals are big, and in some ways you'd be right. We are working on ways to get these down as much as possible. We've had some promising things that we've looked at since I made these graphs, which is good. So then we want to go from this to try and summarize how suspicious we think these matches look based on our models. So one thing we can do is for each game, we can look at the p-value of the odds with respect to that distribution. We can summarize the match like that. So we could look at the lowest p-values, or we could try and find some sort of aggregate over the match. Other considerations to think about are successive odds dependent, maybe. And instead of just looking for big discrepancies in one match, maybe some players just have slightly odd behavior in a series of matches. Can that help? What we've done here is plotted the lowest p-values in each set for a sample of 20 matches. So see, most of them look fine. We've got a couple here where something's going on. So if we have a look at those, the left match is similar in structure to the Davydenko match, but it's not that much. The odds start down here. The player who goes on to win loses the first set. The odds swing off in completely the opposite direction. The odds bear almost no relation to what is happening in the match. And he goes on to win the match. So this is the match that we would want to flag up. By contrast, the match on the right is not one we would want to flag up. The pre-match odds, for whatever reason, disagree with our Glicko model. This could be because of injury news that came across pre-match, could be a problem with our model. But either way, there's a discrepancy at the start, and we never quite recover from that initial difference. So a big area for the future is figuring out how to deal with these matches and only bringing out the ones on the left. So conclusion, tennis match fixing is a problem that occurs in tennis. Different people will tell you different things about how much of a problem it is. If we look just at the odds swings, you miss crucial bits of information that only come about in play. Glicko ratings allow us to quantify the scale of the differences between the odds and our models. There's more work to do on the modelling and more work to do on figuring out exactly how we decide which matches we think are odd. But we think it's a promising start, and we're looking forward to carrying on. And thanks for listening. I'm happy to take any questions anyone has.
Okay, scoring in rugby union. What does it look like? Well, I'm just going to stand back a little bit. I've done a bit of work on football in the past, but I was brought up on rugby union. I'm a Valleys boy, so South Wales. So this is the game about which I'm passionate. And I think, well, obviously rugby is not the leading game in the universe, but I think, well, I want to try and transform the scoring rules to make it more enjoyable for everyone. So the scoring rules in rugby union, what do they look like? Now then, I'm guessing, looking at the audience, most of you know about the scoring rules in rugby union, but essentially we have something called a try in rugby union, and I'm going to show you a try.
Yeah, rugby starts, if you don't know rugby, it starts with a strange dance.
Almost on the halfway line, Kirkpatrick to Williams. This is great stuff. Philman is covering. Chase by Alistair Smith. Oh, that's brilliant! John Williams, Ryan Williams, Colin. John Dawes. Great running. David, Tom David, the halfway line. Brilliant by Grinnell. This is going forwards. The book is out.
Okay, so that's the try. When the ball is placed over the...
Well, when that game was played, that was worth 4 points. Now the try's worth 5. I've got a question. What was the points value of a try in 1870? People who've seen this before are not allowed to answer.
0.
Yeah, 0. And the clue is in the name. Okay? You could try to convert it into a goal. And then the match was determined on the basis of the team with the most goals won. So you converted a try. So here's a conversion. For 2 points now in the current game, the conversion. But back in 1870, if you converted a try, you got a goal, and the match was won on the number of goals. So this is the conversion. You have to kick the ball from a placed position between the posts for 2 points. Okay, there are other methods of scoring. There's the drop goal for 3 points. This is a sort of in-play kick between the posts where the ball's dropped out of the hand and kicked. 3 points. And there's also, well, let's show you a drop goal, actually, first, before we move on.
Another try. Gareth Edwards again. Always Gareth Edwards scoring a drop goal. You have to bear in mind, when I was a 10-year-old, when the first match was played, I also played scrum half in my junior school. We just introduced the game of mini rugby. So I was trying to emulate Gareth.
Best rugby player ever. Okay, so that was the drop goal, and then there's 3 points for a penalty goal, isn't there? Yeah, so there are many ways of scoring in rugby union. And now if we look at some data, we will see the following. Just a little bit about this data first. This is all matches between the top 8 since 1960. Now the top 8, what I call the top 8, are the 5 home nations. Well, Italy are the 6th home nation, aren't they? But the 5 home nations, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, France, and then the 3 Southern Hemisphere nations, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia. So all matches between those 8 teams since 1960. And what we've got here, more or less, plots of scoring rates. So we've got the tries per match in the top left, penalties per match, top right, conversion rate, so the percentage of conversions that are successful, and then the overall total number of scores. So I'm not looking at points, because tries worth 5. I'm looking at the number of scores, so the number of tries plus the number of penalties plus the number of conversions plus the number of drop goals. And what we can see is an increase, well, more than doubling. So, well, what does this mean for the game? Okay, there's another picture here. That's just focusing on one of those plots, produced slightly differently. So mean total number of scores per match per year in the same data set. What does this mean for the game? Well, we don't really know, do we? But if we now step into the modelling world, away from the real world, but into the modelling world, and we look at something called a double Poisson match, we all know this. This is the model that's used to predict football scores due to Mike Mayer in 1982. Another bit of context about that, Mike actually taught me when I was at Sheffield. I was at Sheffield at the time this paper was published as well. So I don't think that's a coincidence really, but that kindled my interest in sport, I think. But anyway, the point I'm making here is that we've got a double Poisson match, okay? So score for team 1, x1 is Poisson Lambda. Score for team 2, x2 is Poisson Epsilon Lambda, where epsilon's a bit bigger than 1. So basically team 2 are a little bit better than team 1, right? Well, you can show that the probability that the weaker side wins goes to 0 as lambda goes to infinity. So as the scoring rate increases, this was said this morning actually in the football stuff, as the scoring rate increases, the probability that the weaker side wins goes to 0. And these plots demonstrate that. And in fact, this is the probability. So here we've got the probability that the weaker side wins as a function of lambda. Think of that as the overall scoring rate for different values of epsilon. So if the teams are reasonably, well, are exactly balanced, this is the lambda 1 case, it doesn't go to 0. But when lambda's less than 1, the bottom line is lambda equals sorry, epsilon equals 3, so the second team are 3 times better than the first team. And by 3 times better, what I mean is they score at a rate 3 times greater than the other team. So, if land is increasing, the game is becoming competitively more unbalanced. And my thesis is that's a bad thing. And rugby, no doubt, lander is increasing. It's gone up about 2.5 times since 1960. That's just focusing on that. Now, question. So, I'm in the modelling world now, aren't I? And I'm saying, well, okay, that's all very well for the double Poisson match, but can I claim the same for rugby? Can I claim an increasing lander is making rugby less competitive? Well, then the question arises, well, is the double Poisson match a suitable approximation to the game of rugby union? Well, I've looked at Poissonness, I've looked at correlations between scores between the two teams. They're more or less uncorrelated. Doesn't mean they're not dependent, but they're more or less uncorrelated. You can look at correlations between the number of tries scored and the number of penalties scored. If you look at that at a team level, what you see is that some teams tend to score more tries than they do penalties. New Zealand are a case of that. They're more of a try-scoring team, whereas England are more of a penalty-scoring team. Well, that's a broad generalization. So, rugby approximates to a double Poisson match. Land is increasing. It's becoming less competitive. That's a bad thing. What can we do about it? Well, we can change the point system. We can roll the clock back to 1870 and make a try worth none. Make a conversion worth 1. And have no other scoring systems. And then you turn a 9-3 game, rugby's more or less a 9-3 or an 8-4 game, put two sides together, generally speaking, one side will score 8 times, the other score 4 times. Football, on the other hand, is a 2-1 game, broadly speaking. So there's much more uncertainty of outcome. So we can turn an 8-4 game into a 2-1 game by just getting rid of some of the methods of scoring. And I'm going to illustrate that now on the Rugby Cup World Tournament. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate the Rugby World Cup Tournament and the various scoring systems. But to simulate the tournament, first of all, what I need to do is estimate all the parameters in the double Poisson match for rugby. And it's a slightly complicated double Poisson match, because you need parameters for all the scoring methods. And this is what we've got here, more or less. I'll blow it up a bit. But every team has a try attack strength, every team has a try defense strength, penalty attack, penalty defense, drop goal, attack strength, drop goal, defense strength, and everybody has a conversion rate. So everybody's got 7 parameters, but you can fit it like you do to the football stuff, and you get the same kind of very simple approach here. I haven't modeled any time varying stuff or haven't put more weight on recent data. Very simple approach. I'm only really interested in the simple stuff here. Okay, so and by way of example, if we look at New Zealand versus Wales, then we can see that, well, the big model is over-parameterized. You have to set one model. You have to set one parameter to a baseline value, and everything else is relative to that. So New Zealand are the baseline here. Their parameter for their try attack is 1, and everybody else is relative to this. Anyway, the way I've set up the model, what this means is that New Zealand will expect to score against Wales that over that number of tries, so about 4. And Wales will expect to score that over that tries, about 1. How am I doing for time? I'm useless on keeping track on time. And etc. So we can then translate this into this. Before I start, another question. Last time Wales beat New Zealand?
Very recently.
No, Ireland did. Ireland did. 1952. And this is a team, this is between the team who's best in the world against a team arguably 8th or 9th best in the world. Last time they beat them was... How many matches have they played, roughly, in that time? 20. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's a bit more than that. Yeah. It's between 20 and 30. Okay, so the model says New Zealand expect to score 4 tries, 3 conversions, 3 penalties, about 10 scores, 36 points. Wales expect to score, well, 36-13. That'd be a par score, I would say, between these two teams. I'm not taking account of any home. In the models I fitted, there is a home parameter. This is on neutral ground. Okay, so rugby, this match is a 10-4 match. So quite competitively unbalanced. What this means is that Wales have a very low chance of winning. Turn this into a, well, 2-1 game. You increase Wales's chance of winning. You get them further up this curve, actually. Yeah, not only am I on a mission to change rugby, I'm on a mission to get Wales to beat New Zealand a bit more often. So, what does the Rugby World Cup look like? Okay, here we are. Here's some results. I'll try and talk you through them a bit. So this is a Rugby World Cup simulation using the current scoring rules, 5 points for a try, 2 for a conversion, etc. And these are simulated outcomes, 10,000 simulations of the tournament. This first column is a simulation of a home and away round robin between all 20 teams. There are 20 teams in a Rugby World Cup tournament, or this tournament there were anyway. And I've played a home and away round robin between them all, and this is New Zealand's win percentage. And then you can see the win percentage of the other teams. So we've got the starting prices for the Rugby World Cup. This is to win the tournament. And what we've got here are the tournament outcomes. This is the proportion of times New Zealand won the Rugby World Cup. This is the proportion of times they reached the semi-final in these 10,000 simulations. So New Zealand are the best in the world, obviously, and they're winning the Rugby World Cup. Look how far apart they are from the next team. This is the lack of competitive balance, arguably, in the game. Okay, let's change the rules. Because the drop goal, yeah, this is not quite 1 point for a conversion and nothing for anything else, but it is effectively, it's actually 3 points for a conversion and 1 point for a drop goal. But drop goals are so rare that this is more or less a 1 point for a try and nothing for anything else. And this is what happens to the probabilities. Actually, it doesn't change very much, does it? It changes a bit, but not very much. So what we've really done here is turned an 8-4 game into a 6-3 game. It's not enough, really. What you've got to do is, instead of placing the ball on the ground when you take a conversion, you've got to drop kick it. That makes it much harder. And you're going to reduce the conversion rate by a significant amount. I've assumed you're going to reduce it by about a half. What happens then? So if the conversion rate is now a half what it was, I've simulated the Rugby World Cup tournament again, and we get something like this. Okay, New Zealand they're still the best team in the world. They're only winning 86% of their matches now. They're still odds-on favourites for the... No, they're not odds-on favourites, they're favourites. Under the current scoring system, they're odds-on favourites because their probability was better than a half. If we look at the scoring rates in the 1960s, we get something that looks a bit like that. So we can improve the competitive balance. Of course, there'll be another effect, won't there, of introducing lower scoring. Well, if you take away all these methods of scoring, there's going to be lots of effects, actually, but I'm looking at another here. I'm looking at surprises and suspense. And in a sense, this is the whole point of increasing competitive balance, so that there is more suspense. You know, Stoke can play Man City at Man City. Man City are 3 times as good, 4 times as good as Stoke at home. You'd expect almost. But 0-0's a possibility. And when it's 0-0, in the 80th minute, you know, everybody is biting their nails. Well, turn on a rugby match between two teams of that quality, that isn't going to happen. Hardly ever, anyway. And here's some stuff on the proportion of matches tied at half-time, tied at full-time, proportion of matches with a surprise result, and I've defined what I mean by surprise there, you can read it, under the different scoring systems. So this is 1 point for a try. Sorry, 1 point for a conversion. This is 1 point for a conversion with a dropped-kicked conversion. So we can so there's an increase in the number of matches tied at half-time. The final. Okay, so a drawback of this approach is 25% of matches are going to be tied at full time. Well, that's a bad thing, isn't it? Well, I'm not so sure, because that's still less than soccer. If you look at soccer World Cups, 7 out of 20 were tied at full time. And when tied at full time. I'm not talking about tied at the end of extra time. So, recap. If we've got a Poisson match, as the scoring rate increases, competitive balance decreases. I'm claiming the International Rugby Union is approximately a double Poisson match. And certainly, scoring rates are increasing. Outcome uncertainty is decreasing. Well, there's the question as to, does it matter? Well, I think if the game is going to become more popular, there needs to be more surprises, there needs to be more suspense. I mean, if you're Georgia playing, or if you're watching or following Georgia in the Rugby World Cup, every match they play, well, apart from when they played Namibia, no, actually, no, Uruguay they played, thinking about it, they didn't have a chance in. They didn't have a chance. So the remedy is 0 for a try and drop kicks of a conversion. Thank you.
I think there's a concept, the nappy factor. I think I need to define it. It originated around 20 years ago by a gold betting expert, certainly published books on the issue, called Keith Elliott. And he came across the observation that at a lot of tournaments, there were lots of pictures of the winner holding their child, their baby, and he thought, well, there's a bit of a correlation though. Maybe that's, if you have a child, maybe you win more tournaments. And of course, it's one of those popular betting myths that people like, and whenever newspapers come across a good story, such as England's Danny Willett winning the Masters last year, lots of news stories. Oh, it must be the nappy factor. It must be the nappy factor. He couldn't have won it by himself. Okay, his baby helped him. That was the Masters. The PGA Championship, one of the other majors last year. Again, the typical image. Final green, kid runs on, holding there. And Jason Day says, well, it's not just I've got a child. It's that it gave him focus, it gave him drive, it gave him perspective. So this isn't just simply something in the area of pseudo-psychology. This is saying, well, I actually think this has an effect. Our current world number one, Dustin Johnson, a little bit more of a story here. Dustin Johnson was banned for 6 months from the game in 2014. The PGA Tour doesn't release the reasons, but there's widespread reports of cocaine and drug and other alcohol abuses, and he took 6 months out of the game. During the time he was away, his child was born, and he comes back, and he's a completely new player. He not only wins major championship, he's now the world number one, and it's been a role figure to my child. That life I lived as the very rich sports person is not something I want to do anymore. And so having a child changed him, and he's now world number one, and a dominant one in that. So again, enough images of kids running onto greens at the end of a tournament and saying there must be a relationship. When I looked at this, I found that there's actually a lot of effects that have been purported to be found in the literature, whether it's economic or psychology or sociology or others, that say, well, having a child has an effect on you. I know I say lots of people, yeah, when I was much younger, yeah, having a child, it will change you. It certainly did me. But one of the key things in the literature is it makes a difference the sex of your first child. If you're first born as a son, as was in my case, you're less likely to get divorced. Okay? In our surveys, this is what's been found. And it isn't just divorce, it's actual general levels of happiness. The father's happiness reported after they've had a son is 75% higher than it was for fathers who reported, I just had a daughter. And it's a quite substantial difference relative to mothers as well. So it makes you happier, it makes your marriage better. I suppose we could call that the, no, come on to that next. Fathers spend more time with children. Again, lots of sociological studies find this. If your firstborn is a son, you spend more time with them, not just that first child. And it's linked to smaller family sizes. I suppose I could call this the Henry VIII effect. You know, keep marrying, keep trying, keep killing your wife until eventually you have a son, and then you kind of stop, maybe. Okay, we find a lot of surveys of this in developing countries. Okay, that desire to have a son. And then one that's most interesting is there's a political dimension to this. If your firstborn child is a son, you're more likely to vote Conservative in this country or Republican in the United States than if your firstborn child was a daughter. And interestingly, it's not just in voter patterns. A study into senators in the US found that senators who were Republicans were far more likely to have a son as their firstborn child than Democrats. So there's lots of effects in the literature. Yes, those who've had children know how it's changed us. And lots of things in the literature about how it also changes if that firstborn is a son. I'm an economist, so my primary focus within this was the economic effects. But obviously, there's a lot of psychology in this. In the economic effects, we talk about what is a motherhood penalty for having a child versus a fatherhood premium. And motherhood penalty is that the wages drop. The average wage for women drop post-birth. For men, it increases according to Lundberg and Rose. And that is around 9%, is what they found. And like I said, Keith Elliott, he uses this as evidence for his concept of the Nappy factor. In terms of hours of work, again, the difference between the mother and the father is quite clear. Lundberg found that there's a 45% reduction in hours worked in that first year for women, very slow to increase thereafter, but there's no significant change for fathers. Okay. So, that's for the first child. The second child is unimportant. It has no further effects upon the earnings or the hours of works of the parents. But my focus in my study is about the fathers. Because what we're going to do is to try and put this. It's one thing to say, yeah, fine, these golfers, they had lots of kids, they won, and we can find lots of news stories to do this. But we need to put into a framework to say, what else are we controlling for? And in the economics literature, that's largely borne out for a human capital approach. And the human capital approach is based upon the observation that there's a relationship between your earnings per week and your age. As you're young, you go to university, you train, your skills increase, your experience in your job, they reach a plateau in your 40s, 50s, and by the mid-50s onwards, then all those skills and those training that you did is no longer relevant and your earnings drop quite substantially. And that's very stable over a 10-year period. And that's a framework in which most of the labour economics on earnings is based around this human capital approach based from Gary Becker over 50 years ago. There's a couple of problems with this. One, it's rather simplistic to say it's just something that varies with age. There must be other things that are going on. Are there other things that rise and fall with your age? Again, I'm going to look at children. Age is not the same as work experience. Again, we talk about your ability to raise your wage, the work experience, the skills that you accrue on the job don't come automatically simply because I've got another birthday, I'm a year older, I should get my money. And the final one is, well, in terms of this one, then there's a selection bias. Because, yes, we've got a plateau, but there is a self-selection of people transitioning to retirement, they'll work less, okay, if their income allows them to do so. Now that's in general, but I'm looking at sport, and the life earnings of sportsmen is very different, okay. Golf is quite long, but it's certainly not going into the 50s. For golfers, it's like this. In that, once again, we've got a rise in terms of the earnings of golfers as they go through their 20s and they reach a peak by the early 30s. We then got a plateau, slight decline until the end of the 30s, and you hit your 40th birthday, and, well, okay, you're not going to be competitive very much more. And that's in golf, but that's a relatively long period at which people are competitive. But again, we can look for human capital factors that are focused upon why this rises and plateaus here, and take those into account. So, what's my data source? My data source is the PGA Tour. The PGA Tour media guide is published online. I've taken 225, I've used the last year's PGA Tour media guide. I've got 225 golfers who meet the criteria in terms of they've got the information available or some primary criteria, no time to go into minor amendments. But crucially, what this does is that it gives the date at which the children are born. To me, it's quite unusual that you should publish online, my child was born on this date. I won't tell you when I married my wife, but I'll tell you when my kids' birthdays are. Okay, and of course, yes, we can look at Twitter, we can get lots of images from Twitter and messages and find out, some of the missing data, but we've got data in relation to children that we would find very difficult to collect and very expensive to collect otherwise. The longitudinal studies that we have are based around census or survey data that people collect, okay? And even if we get the actual dates at which they got married and they had children, and we got data in terms of their jobs and their wages and the rest of it, it's still very difficult to pinpoint what is the effect of having a child upon your wages. We can say that for all we looked at before, there are kind of pull factors that as our skills increase, as our experience increase, that kind of pulls up the salary scales in our work, and our income should rise as we get older. But those push factors, on the property ladder, I need to buy a new house and expand my house, or I've got children, I need to earn more money. How many of us can actually affect that around the birth of our children? It takes time, if not years, to actually see a birth of children and a material, even if it does have a material effect in terms of psychology, a material effect in terms of age, in terms of earnings. So that's why it's not been found in the literature so far. So sports is really an excellent laboratory for the testing of economics and psychology in particular, those theories, those hypotheses. We're able to measure productivity directly. In other words, productivity, the more productive you are, the more you practice, in theory, the less shots it will take you to complete a course. Okay? We've got direct data on earnings, and we've got a 20-year period, up to a 20-year period, which is relatively long for any longitudinal study. The other thing I want to highlight, again, that makes this sport and golf quite different, is the prize money distribution is highly nonlinear. In that a golf tournament typically lasts 4 days. After 2 days, if you're not inside the top 70, you earn zero. You've incurred all the costs of all the travel, or your caddy, everything else, you earn zero. You provided nothing for your child, or for your family, or whatever. If you're 50th, or 40th, or 30th, that extra effect that you put in that extra effort you put in has a very small effect upon your earnings. But if you're in the top 10, that marginal increase in your earnings can be incredibly large. So one of the things I want to look at when I look at not just productivity, how does it affect people's ability to score better, I'm also looking at the effect on their earnings. And the earnings, we could take this in mind, okay? Your earnings will increase if you're at that part of the leaderboard, okay? High pressure. Okay, the empirical specification, we're not going through the model. The empirical specifications, I'm looking at two variables, two dependent variables, either the average score or the log of earnings. I've got a vector of, again, this is based on the human capital approach, human capital variables. I've used a variety of things that I've got available to them, the amount of years that they've been a professional on tour or not, and so on. And largely, it's age, quadratic term, dummy variables to measure first year on U2, because you're learning the course for the first time, and other effects. I'm capturing those in our vector. And then the thing that I'm really interested in, the vector of child variables. So, number of children, the ages of the children, and the gender of the children. Okay? And again, from that profile, okay, a bit of research sometimes in terms of name, was it male, was it female, yes. Okay, but I've got the ages, I've got the dates. And then I'm saying this is going to be a fixed effects regression model, so there's a latent underlying ability that says this player has an underlying skill that makes them a journeyman professional. This level of skill that makes Rory McIlroy or Justin Johnson, that will make them a very leading golfer. And beyond that, human capital effects and potential demographic effects will affect that as well. Okay, so let's look at some results from this approach. I'm only including the demographic variables, okay? All the coefficients on the human capital variables are in line with expectations and are significant. Okay? What's the key result? From our baseline model, the simplest model is that having a child, remember in golf, the better you are, the lower your score. Okay? So, having a child reduces your score by 0.93 shots per round. It raises your income, so we're going to see an opposite sign here. It raises your income from our baseline model of 10%, just having a child. Who's it to? Relative to, remember, this is a dummy variable, child or no child. This is relative to male golfers without a child. So relative to childless golfers, it raises incomes by 10% over this sample period. It rises slightly as you go older. The effect is sustained for your second child. It doesn't change very much. But for that third child, it's gone altogether. Slightly different effects, and we won't spend too long on this, but we'll come back to this. Slightly different effects upon score. And again, the key difference, how do you cope at the end of the tournament when there's a lot of money at stake? Okay, that's having children. One of the slides talks about the importance of the gender of your child. Okay, what's our key result here? If you have one child, so remember what I said, my mission is to get professional sportsmen to have a child, but stop at a child. That's my baseline result here. If you have a single child, and that child is a boy, again in line with the literature in other sociological studies, your earnings increase not by 10% with the previous slide, by 16% relative to childless golfers. If that you have one child that was a daughter, there's no effect on earnings. Okay? Even though there is an effect on productivity. Okay? Come back to that. If you have two children, the effect drops from 16% down to 10 to 12%, just a very small decrease, providing the first child was a boy. Doesn't matter thereafter, girl or boy. And in terms of the other things that are in there, there's some slightly unusual results because, again, I'm not just looking at earnings, I've got productivity data, again, what's your capacity to produce a lower score? Having daughters has an effect upon increasing your productivity, but not so much of the one variable in terms of increasing your income. Is this a temporary or permanent effect? Well, in terms of earnings, it's significant all the way through. In fact, slightly rising throughout the period as I've grouped the age bands together. Not so significant for productivity, a little bit more volatility, but this is not simply a nappy factor. Having a child in my data sample, in the test we've done, does actually permanently raise your income relative to those without a child. But again, this is where the second child kicks in. The second child has no effect on income up until the age of 6. Thereafter, it's significant and negative, and that will decrease your ability to earn money, relative, again, to my dummy variable of childless parents. The effect, again, is quite significant in terms of productivity. The second child raises your score, makes you a worse golfer within the data set. And the final one, again, I've stripped out a lot of these now. I'm only looking at the age of the first child and whether they're a boy or a girl. If the first boy is a son, again, it's as in the previous slide. It's positive and persistent in terms of a permanent positive increase in earnings. Does it increase your productivity? Not straight away, but yeah, after a short while. If your first child is a daughter, where's the increase in earnings? It's not there. It's not there until your first child as a daughter reaches the age of 9 onwards, and it's exactly the same for productivity. Okay, so child 2, child 3 onwards, no gender differences between them. Again, this is just a snapshot of the results. So what's the overall results from this approach? Fatherhood increases earnings by 10%. Okay, so go and have a child. Just don't have a second one. And this rises up to 16% if, by any chance, the first one's a son. Otherwise, it drops down to 0. If you have a second child, from my sample of 225 golfers, then the second child reduces the fatherhood premium. This elusive thing that's quite difficult to measure in the literature so far, that can be found in this, but only once they reach school age. Final observation, and again, I draw the thing about the earnings profile, the prize money distribution within golf. That ability to finish first rather than second, or second rather than third, has a huge effect upon earnings. That ability to finish 30th rather than 29 has very, very little effect upon earnings. Now, we've found quite a substantial difference in the earnings if the firstborn is a son. And so this is moving away from human capital theory in that respect, in that, obviously we want to do more into the psychology of this. What we're observing is that if your firstborn child is a son, that you end up to be much more competitive in high pressure situations. And that is what gives you a large increase in earnings without the corresponding increase in productivity. And that's my results to date.